Hello, my name's Michelle Dyer. I'm a researcher with the Stockholm Resilience Centre. Today I'm talking about gender equality as a cross-cutting issue in social ecological resilience. So let's start with defining what gender is. Gender is an identity category. It's a way of putting people into groups. And gender are categories used as mechanisms of social organisation across cultures worldwide. So some other categories that we use are things like race, caste, class, religion, kin groupings. But gender is one that cuts across many of these other social categories. And gender is a fundamental mechanism of social organisation, and we find it across cultures worldwide. But it's based on, but not the same as biology. So I'll give you an example. Until October 2017, women in Saudi Arabia were not allowed to drive a car. So clearly there's no biological reason why women can't drive cars. This restriction is solely according to a cultural notion of what's appropriate for women as a gender category. So gender equality then is about the social power dynamics that influence how we categorise and position people and the choices that are made available to them according to their gender. So why is gender equality important? We can summarise this, I think, in three reasons: that there is moral, ethical and practical reasons why gender equality is important. Firstly, I think it's the intrinsic right to freedom from oppression of all people and to a life with dignity and choices. And practically, we need to think about what kind of future do we want for humanity, what kind of future do we want to live in. So inequality is of all kinds, including gender inequality, is a hallmark of development in the Anthropocene. And this has had, as we can see, fairly catastrophic social and environmental consequences. So we've seen increasing social inequality and increasing imbalances environmentally. And these two things can't be separated from each other. These consequences and their drivers are social ecological, and the social and the environmental are co-constituted, and they're co-evolving, and they feed back into each other. As a whole, the research shows that if we have greater gender equality, aside from leading to a better life for all, it also leads to better environmental decision making and greater well-being outcomes as a result for societies as a whole. So over the past few decades, our understanding of gender inequality has prompted a huge outpouring of sex disaggregated data. And what this data shows is overwhelmingly women as a social group have a very persistent and intractable disadvantage globally. So this cuts across countries of different economic status, and it cuts across many different cultures. And I'll just summarise these really quickly in three categories: politically, economically and socially. So politically, this graph is just showing you percentage of women in parliament. So you can see that there are very few countries that have more than 50% women in parliament. In fact, there's only two. So Bolivia is just over 50% and Rwanda is just over 60%. And the majority of the world's parliaments, 3/4 of national parliaments worldwide, have less than 30% women in their parliaments. And I just want to read you a little quote from this very sweet book about historical text from the suffragette movement, which was women campaigning to have the vote, which is itself a very recent thing that women had the vote, only the last 100 years or so. And they had 14 reasons for supporting women's suffrage, and their reason number one is because it is the foundation of all political liberty that those who obey the law should be able to have a voice in choosing those who make the law. And what we can see from this little graph is that although women now have the vote in nearly every country in the world, they are still overwhelmingly unrepresented in national parliaments. And this, of course, has an effect on what sort of decisions get made and what sort of decisions get put on the table. And on an economic front, we see that there is these very persistent economic gender gaps. This figure comes from the World Economic Forum 2017 Global Gender Gap Report. And what it's showing is, given current trends in these regions of the world, how long it will take before men and women have economic equality. So Western Europe's topping the list there. So in 47 years, they say, given current trends, there'll be economic equality. And North America, right down the bottom there, is actually going backwards, which means that there will never be gender equality, economic equality, given current trends. So that makes, and the next one up the list there is South Asia, more than 1,000 years, which is really far too long. And even 47 years looks good in comparison, but in 47 years I'll be in my 90s, and frankly I'm not prepared to wait that long. So just to show what is meant by this term as gender as a cross-cutting issue, this particular graph comes from the US Census Bureau, and what it's showing is median annual earnings divided by race and ethnicity. So these are, the US Census Bureau makes these racial categories, and inside each category it's divided again, it's sex disaggregated, so it has women in orange and men in blue. So what you can see, there's quite vast differences between the racial categories. You can also see that inside each of the categories, women consistently earn less than men. So this is what we mean when we say gender is a cross-cutting issue. And lastly, just thinking about the social aspect of gender inequality. And this particular graph again comes from the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap report, and it's showing that women have a disproportionate share of the unpaid work. And this unpaid work we can call social reproduction, and this is labour for family well-being, care of children, looking after the elderly and looking after the sick. So across all these three categories, the political, the economic and the social, there's been a trend in development interventions to use this sex disaggregated data, as I've presented to you here, and take technical measures to increase numbers of women and close these gaps. So gender parity actually is the focus here. So gender parity meaning equal numbers of men and women rather than actually gender equality. So just to bring this into a development perspective, these graphs that I've just shown you about gender inequality, they ring true across the world, however you divide it economically. But if you Google for images of women in development, what you will get is an image of a woman in a rural setting, often with a baby and using some kind of low-tech tool. And this brings up a really important issue when thinking about gender equality and development. As you can see, there's a persistent gender equality regardless of economic status of countries, but which women are we actually talking about? So this picture of the rural woman with a baby and low tech, this is this picture of a third world woman, poor, uneducated, traditional, sexually constrained and controlled by patriarchal kinship rules. And this is set up in opposition to what's seen as a liberated, a modern Western woman, modern, educated, sexually liberated and individually free. So there's this narrative going on in the storyline of the third world woman. And it's in this way that knowledge about gender is made into a discrete thing, a discretely categorized gendered subject that can be inserted into policy frameworks, into training programs and into project goals. And this is making the field of gender and development into a real thing, making it governable. So in the development world, a lot of the solutions to gender inequality relate to technical solutions related to women's economic empowerment. And there's a very popular intervention called Women as Smart Economics. So this particular intervention sells gender equality as a profitable thing, an economically profitable thing to do. So this just means inserting women into the economic system, which is the solution to the way that they're representing the problem, is to feed the women into this system that actually created this inequality in the first place. So just to summarise what we've been talking about so far, this is a diagram taken from the work of Steve Lane and Jamila Haider on poverty traps. And we can see type 1 and 2, this is what we might call business as usual. So type 1 is the institution, the system as it already exists, just women going into this system, just women that manage to be successful in this system are pushing over the barriers. Type 2 is when we have positive discrimination measures, things like reserved seats for women in Parliament, workplace diversity hiring laws. So in the language here of Steve and Jamila's diagram, lowering the barrier, so making it easier for women to come into the system. But again, nothing's changed about the system. And then when we start thinking about resilient systems and visions for the future, we can look into type 3. And type 3 is really about transforming the system altogether, not just inserting women into a system that has created the conditions of oppression. Type 3 is really about what other ways are there to think about framing the problem, what other perspectives can we bring in, how can we bring in multiple perspectives. So understanding that changing the shape of the institution and transforming this system gives us possible other ways of doing, of seeing and understanding that allow us to move away from this business as usual system that thrives and actually needs inequality to propagate. So just to think about, well, how is it that we can change the shape of the system, and are there some examples? And I think a really nice example is Sweden's parental leave laws. So in Sweden, they have very generous parental leave, and parental leave is set up to allow both parents to take significant amounts of time away for work. And one of the really significant things about the laws there are that there's 480 days of parental leave. Both parents are encouraged to take half each, but inside their half there's 90 days that are only each parent can take. So you can't transfer your 90 days to the other parent, and if you don't take the 90 days then you lose it altogether. So it's valuable to take parental leave, and we will give you an incentive to do it. And this, we can start to think about, well, how does this change gender relations, rather than just thinking about sex disaggregated data, this is what men are doing, this is what women are doing. We're thinking about how do we change this power dynamic, and one of the ways that we can do this is by giving value to the work of social reproduction, actually giving economic incentives, and that also has a feedback effect into workplace environments. So it's considered legitimate to take time out of your work to be a parent and to give time to social reproduction. So in summary, I think we need to keep the focus here on relations and dynamics so we can move our thinking beyond descriptive sex disaggregated data. So we can keep the focus here on these three premises: understanding firstly that gender is always relational. The concept of gender doesn't exist outside power relations, using systems thinking to help us think about how these relations feed into each other and co-evolve and change. Secondly, that power is always relational. Again, it's not a finite zero-sum game. We're not talking about a finite amount of power that we take some away from one person to give to another, that this is actually a system that is flowing and moving. And point three, gender and power relations are co-constituted with environmental issues and environments. So we can say, to finish, that understanding the social power dynamics of gender and environment relations can help us shape our research practice, our development policy, and our visions for a sustainable future. Thank you.